Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, it's Jessa. Welcome back to another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. I am so glad you're here. Grateful that you're here, really. I am talking today to Jessica Levith, and she is a licensed marriage and family therapist in California, and she has taken the out-of-control sexual behavior model, a way of looking at sexual behavior that is compulsive or out of control or problematic. There's a whole treatment model that's been developed around that I've interviewed a couple people about, actually. And she has taken it and specifically extended it to cisgendered women and out-of-control sexual behavior, and the specific challenges and messages and oppressions, really, that women have had that shape their thinking about sex, their choices about sex, their behavior around sex, and the treatment that she then provides for people that are coming in feeling like their behavior is out of control. So anyway, fascinating conversation. I feel like we could just scratch the surface, and this is a pretty long interview. But I think you're going to get a ton out of it, even if you don't feel like your sexual behavior is out of control. There's so much here about sexual health and the impacts of these influences on our sexuality that are relevant to all of us. So enjoy. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so that you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. All right. So, Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me and sharing your platform.
Yeah, I'm excited about this because I have had a couple different people on the show talking about OCSB, out of control sexual behavior, for people that don't know what that means, but not specifically with women. So this is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I remembered that you had Doug on, who is so eloquent, and he really summed it up well. So if you want a deep background of how he came to create this model with Michael Vigorito, that's last January, I think.
Yeah, it might have been. I can't remember exactly. But people probably, I'm sure they're not listening to every single episode. So we're going to start from the basics about, what is OCSB as a framework, and what makes that different? Is this the same thing as sex addiction treatment? What do you want to say about just setting up what OCSB framework is?
Sure. Yeah. So OCSB is out of control sexual behavior, and it is a model that it is a perception from the client's point of view of, is what I'm doing with regards to my sexual behavior feeling out of control? Are my urges, thoughts, and behaviors feeling out of control for me? And that very much sets it apart from a more prescribed model. The most common is the CSAT model, the sex addiction model. And there are a few differences, key differences. And one is this idea of OCSB being a sexual health focused treatment, which means it really is focusing on how do you create your own unique vision of sexual health, and then step into this, embody this life of the sexual health life, as opposed to cutting out pieces of your sexuality and splitting from this part of your sexuality and basically making it go underground or go away. And a couple of the differences in this model is, aside from the sexual health piece, is there is a conflation. There's a history of conflation of non-consensual behaviors, sexual behaviors, and out of control behavior. In the sex addiction model, there is this. It's almost a feeling of a moral degradation. Like the longer you go with what would be considered sexual addiction untreated, the more you are going to, morally degrade and eventually turn to behaviors that could become non-consensual. Like all of a sudden, that's going to turn you on.
So you get to be like a perpetrator if you follow this trail long enough or something.
Right. Without treatment.
Wow.
And that is inaccurate. These are apples and oranges. And one of the first things that we do with the OCS model is we make sure that if someone is presenting with non-consensual sexual behaviors, we refer them out. We can't. Right. You need specialized treatment, and the risk of working outside of your scope of practice as a therapist is high.
Right.
And it's not ethical. The first thing we rule out is that we want people who are internally motivated. So a lot of times people in the sex addiction model are going into treatment because a partner or a family member is mortified at what they may discover. And in order to save whatever family ties, they say, okay, yes, I'm going to accept this label as a diseased person and go into treatment. Well, we want people that are coming in that are genuinely interested in fundamentally shifting how they see their sexuality in a healthy way. We're moving towards sexual health. I think that another key piece of this is the sex addiction model sees sexual addiction as a disease, and we see it as a problem. We're not saying it's not an extreme problem or a severe problem for people, but it's on the spectrum of sexual struggles. It's not a worry because it's much more complicated and intense, but it's not a disorder. It's not a sexual disease. It's not.
Yeah.
And in saying that it's a disease, Doug talks a lot about, going into the helpless and the hopeless. If I say this is a disease, then I get to step back from all of my agreements that I have relationally and all of my responsibilities, But if I own that this is a real human behavior problem, then I now have a responsibility to hold to these agreements and figure out a way to begin to regulate myself. Self-regulation, and then regulate myself in relation to others, and then look at my erotic conflicts in order to live in the sexual health.
So what about, I'm sure I asked Doug this too, but what about somebody comes in, you said it's client defined, it feels out of control to me. Mm-hmm. What about when that is purely from shame training? I shouldn't be masturbating. This is a huge problem. It feels out of control. You got to help me fix this. Is there room to help people broaden what they see as sexual health? Or is it just like, okay, you don't want to masturbate, I'm going to help you not masturbate?
I think telling someone that they should not masturbate is not going to happen.
No, but I mean, if they're saying my goal is to not masturbate because masturbation is wrong and it feels out of control. Yeah. Do you get on board with that and help them achieve that? Or is there some work you do to sort of be like, yeah, I understand it feels out of control, but maybe there's ways to look differently at this?
The latter. We don't do an erotictomy, as Doug would say. I'm not in the business of telling someone to split from their sexuality. Right. That is not what I do. And I think that is a big piece of what the medical models are going for. Let's just cut the solo sex out. Let's just get rid of it, and everyone would be happy. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that what you're describing could be a religious and moral conflict with their sexuality, and that is what you need to be processing.
Yeah.
Is this conflict? If masturbating is painful for them, I may refer them to a medical doctor, but my job is not to help them learn how to not masturbate.
Right. Because it just seems like people are going to come in saying something feels out of control. And it's not the behavior we have to shift, it's the mindset we might want to try to shift.
Very oftentimes, and I think that speaks really well to when I work with women, and the piece that I add to this model in working with women is exploring the history and the current, just this systemic social imprinting that we get as women, and the expectations, both implicit and explicit, coming from the micro, meso, and macro level. I mean, it's everywhere of what we are supposed to be sexually, how we're supposed to look and feel and smell and act. And, and it's been this way since I did a nosedive into, women's consciousness and sexual history. And Sappho, the Greek poet, people were split. It was a hot debate.
Wow.
Is she an amazing poet who is expressing her love for other women, or is she a demon?
Yeah.
And then, you go through the Middle Ages and Christianity and this puritanical dogma getting laid down, which just killed any expression of sexuality, period. But then especially for women, the social value of women was just diminished. And then you bring it up through the invent of psychiatry and psychology. And you've got Kraft Ebing and Benjamin Rush, who are saying that, women wanting sexual pleasure for anything other than creating a child is morbid.
Yeah.
It wasn't looking good for us.
Yeah, right.
So, but then, there are these, in the 60s, there was a group of psychoanalytic women that went to the APA and said, look, you have to stop comparing our sexuality and our desire to what you consider the gold standard, which is men.
Yeah.
You have to stop doing this. And so that kind of began that was around the time of the women's liberation movement. And you had people like Susan Brown Miller and Elizabeth Stewart and Nancy Friday. And then, people like Carol Queen come along. And now you've got, Hardy and Easton and Nagoski and the feminist porn book. And it's so exciting right now, and I just felt like when I was introduced to Doug's model, I was so relieved because I had not known anything else. I didn't know about ASECT, which is, the organization that certifies sex therapists. I didn't know that CSAT therapists did not get any sexual health training.
Mm-hmm.
It was the only way that I had a conceptualization of problematic sexual behavior. And so when I learned about Doug, I got the book and immediately just felt like this breath of relief of like, okay, this, because it's based in human behavior theory, it opens itself up to any modality that's going to work.
Mm.
It opens itself up to, this isn't about solving a disease. This is about exploring human behavior.
Yeah.
Which was so easily adaptable for women.
Yeah. So before we get too specific about women, can you go over how the clinical journey looks with OCSB in general? Like, what does this pathway look like? What is the sort of protocol or whatever? And then we can talk about how you've, adapted that for women.
Definitely. So there's an initial screening. And in that initial screening, we are screening for non-consensual sex, ruling that out. We're screening for internal motivation. We're screening for any kind of acute issue that might be present that would interfere with the work. So that is physical threat, if to self or others, substance use, relationship with substance use and abuse. You're looking for other comorbid mental health issues and then also physical health issues. And so if you go through the screening, you then go on to the assessment, which is usually a litany of tests, but the cores are, you take the ACE, which is the Adverse Child Experience. You take the SSAS, which is the Sexual Symptom Assessment Scale, and then the SES-SIS, so Sexual Inhibition Scale and Sexual Excitation Scale. Now, all along the way, as you're doing this, because this is a semi-structured assessment.
Yeah, sounds like it.
That's the structured piece. During this process, the therapist is really starting to learn from the client. Like, who is this person? They are assessing family of origin history. As we're talking, it's not just like, okay, score 1, 2, 3, or this. It is like, okay, so why did you give me a 2 on that? What brings that out? And then we get into family of origin history. We get into attachment styles, which is crucial. And then after all of the assessment, you then you're helping the client learn new language of how to speak in sexual health terms instead of pathology terms. And you take all of this information and you create what's called a sexual health plan. And in the sexual health plan, this is when you're having the client say, okay, I'm going to have a column for boundaries. These are things I know that if I engage in this, I am breaking one of what's called 6 principles of sexual health. It's a lot. Sorry, I Doug would.
Now everybody get a notebook.
Everyone's getting. I am bastardizing this. So let me back.
But I am going to want you to talk about whatever these 6 principles are. So.
Yes. So sexual health, is the foundation of OCSB work, and the 6 principles of sexual health are the foundation of sexual health. You live within these 6 principles, you are in sexual health, and these principles are. It's consensual sexual activity. So the sexual activity has to be consensual. It has to be non-exploitative. That occurs a lot when there's misrepresentations and lying in relationships. There is honesty, shared values, protection from STIs and HIV and unwanted pregnancy, which is a really big issue in working with women. And then there's mutual pleasure or solo pleasure, because sometimes people aren't coming in because they're in a relationship. Right. It's about solo behavior and solo pleasure.
Yeah.
And so you have these 6 principles of sexual health. You live in these 6 principles, you are living in sexual health.
I do want to just point out real quick how great it is that pleasure is one of those 6 things.
Oh, yes, for sure.
Because, I think people think about sexual health and first of all, it seems sort of medical, or it seems like it's good enough or whatever. But the fact that, our sexual expectations and our sex life should include pleasure. This is just as important as consent and, physical safety and all those things.
Well, absolutely.
Sorry, I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you for slowing me down on that, because it's really important to note that until the 90s, sexual health included, it was only about abstaining or avoiding STIs or unwanted pregnancy. That was sexual health.
Well, and that's what sex ed is basically, right? How do you not get ill, and how do you not have a baby?
That's right.
And maybe how do you put a penis in a vagina? And that's the extent. Where's the conversation about, pleasure or consent?
Exactly. So, yeah. And in our vision of sexual health, in the OCSB model, it really is the 3 narratives are balancing sexual safety and sexual pleasure, having them equal in weight, and then also protecting the sexual rights of everyone involved. You know, and I'm just thinking about here's another bubble off of the description of OCSB. So if you are living within the 6 principles of sexual health, you are at the end of the assessment, you have all of this information, and some of it is data, objective data, and some of it is subjective data from the therapist working with you. And you come up with a plan, a sexual health plan. And this plan has 3 columns. And the first column is boundaries. These are the behaviors where when you cross these boundaries, you are not in sexual health. And you are breaking these agreements that you've made to yourself and with the therapist. And in the middle column, there is the ambivalence and also the high risk behavior. So this is stuff that that if you were to put this in the boundaries column right now, you wouldn't be able to hold it. And it's about getting honest about that. And I think that is another big difference between the medical models and the OCSB model, is that medical models are abstain, 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 just put it on your bottom lines. And then, if you break it, you've broken sobriety. And it's very punitive. It ends up with you going, oh God, I've lost my time again.
Yeah.
And people just end up giving up.
Right.
Whereas we recognize, what? You are ambivalent about this. There is a part of you right now, the competing motivations within you, the desire to this sexual desire is so powerful, and you have to honor that while also understanding it's taking over your executive functioning, and you're going to cross that boundary.
Yeah.
And then in the far column, there's the sexual health, and this is just what you look like as you live in sexual health. This is your ideal, these are your goals and aspirations for how you want to be sexually. And in your life in general, it's honesty. It's living within these principles of having shared values with the people that you are sexual with.
Right. Hey, this is Jess. I'm just taking a quick break, and I want to make sure you know about the guide I wrote about how to talk to your partner about sexual concerns. This comes up a lot in my practice. People have struggles, and it takes them so long to bring it up with their partner. They're afraid that that conversation is going to go badly. Their partner's going to be upset. The partner's going to be defensive, or they just don't know how to talk about sex and sexual problems. Common problem. So I wrote this guide that really helps you address this. It helps you prepare for the conversation, how to introduce the conversation, and then tips about how to actually get through the conversation so that you can change things with your partner as a team. If you are interested in this guide, you can find it at bettersexpodcast.com/guide. Again, bettersexpodcast.com/guide. Happy to send it to you. All right, so what made you, maybe just besides being a woman yourself, but what made you decide or think, oh, we need to expand this or apply this specifically to women? Or maybe that was it your clientele that you had at the time, or what happened?
Well, as I said, I was in the medical model for a long time. And I noticed that the dialogue, most of the dialogue is geared towards cisgender white men. And when I read Doug's book, and I realized that it was based on human behavior theory and that it was easily translatable. And then I think even in the book somewhere, Doug and Michael talk about, this is for cisgender men, and we're going to own that. And if anyone else wants to take the torch, they didn't say it like that, I'm sure.
Right.
But go for it, and so I did.
Okay. There was a message to you in the book, right? Like, oh my gosh, she's talking to me.
The last page, I closed the book. I'm like, well, all right, here we go.
Okay.
And so I went back through the book and I realized that much of the model, like almost all of the model, is translatable for clinical work with women. However, women's OCSB treatment must incorporate a deeper understanding of both the historical and present day implicit and explicit expectations and messages projected onto women and internalized by them.
Yeah.
And as I was going through the book, I was realizing I really need to get a deeper history of, well, how do we get these messaging? How does it end up in us? And so I went and just took a nosedive into the history of women's sexuality and how it's been perceived, mainly in the Western culture and predominantly in the United States. And what I was realizing was that I was noticing some very similar through lines, some groups of commonalities. And I ended up writing a paper on Doug and Michael's book, and it's on ResearchGate. It's quite long. So what I found was historic and systemic power over women's right and means to control birth. So that's one. Mm-hmm. Sexual functioning, appearance, and pleasure. That's two. And three is sexual and social value. And these are how I have found historically women have been impacted by how others perceive them, how the authority, who would be the men, and this is not, men held the power, that's not an accusation, and to a certain degree, men still do. Yeah. Most of the research on sexuality is on men. Mm-hmm. And things are starting to shift. But, for example, in my work with women, I use some assessments that were co-created by women to be able to get a different perspective. But in going over, would you mind if I went over these three pieces?
No, not please.
Why I'm here?
Yeah, exactly. While you're here. Yeah, no, please talk about that.
And that's another whole piece of women in their apologizing. So we are talking about historic systemic power over women's right and means to control birth, sexual functioning, appearance, and pleasure, and sexual and social value. And these are the potential ways that women can be impacted by social cultural value systems. So for the right and means to control birth, we're talking about pregnancy and termination. If we're going to talk specifically about the U.S., there was a time with the Comstock Act where it was prohibited to sell or distribute obscene and illicit materials. And that would be what contraception and sexual education and material on abortion was considered. It was considered illicit and obscene. And now, even now, theoretically, there's universal access to birth control, but I think it's common knowledge that a woman's access to birth control is really contingent upon where she lives, her access to a prescribing provider, health insurance if she has any, and her socioeconomic standing. Does she have enough money to pay for it? And historically, women with less resources and women of color have been harmed the most by this. If we go to forced sterilization, that is another way of controlling women's right to conceive. And it's an irreversible procedure that ends someone's ability to reproduce. And Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1927 was talking about in favor of sterilizing people with disabilities.
Wow.
And a lot of these were women, and you think, oh, how horrific is this? And it was. And then I did some further research and found an article from 2013. It was a report by the Center for Investigative Reporting that uncovered in California in the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, doctors sterilized 150 women from 2006 to 2010 without authorization.
Yeah.
So this is still happening. And these women are mainly women of color.
Yeah. And I think I read something recently about this happening in refugee camps or in as people are crossing the border. I don't know if that's in the US or not, but.
I can't speak to that, but I am sure these same kinds of articles will be coming out.
Right.
And I would not be surprised.
Yeah.
So the next cluster of impact that I found was power over sexual functioning, appearance, and pleasure. One of these is hotly debated. It is genital cutting or circumcision. And, the international communities come together and they're very against any kind of genital cutting. It's also called genital mutilation. But the reason why I call it genital cutting is because it's complicated. In some cultures, this is, they counter argue and they say it's a rite of passage and it's misunderstood. And so I am not going to sit in judgment of someone's culture. What I'm going to do is if someone comes into my office and they have had genital cutting, I'm not going to assume that they have been traumatized by this. I'm going to let them tell me how or if it's impacted them. But that is just another potential piece of how women in their decision-making around sexual behavior, when Doug and Michael talk about the decisional balance, meaning the competing motivations of affective versus deliberative, affective being the more primitive, aversion to pain, going towards desire, and deliberative, the executive functioning, the long-term planning, right? When you're making these decisions, all of these pieces of historical social imprinting for women, it's all involved.
Okay. I was going to ask, what's the relevance clinically? Is it just the insight that this is affecting us, or how is this showing up in people's behavior, their decisions, what they think might be out of control, or how they're, what they're doing sexually?
Exactly. Yeah. So what it looks like is because so much of the OCSB model is translatable, because it's human behavior, and because women and men, it is sexual desire is not a gender-based thing.
Right.
It's a human-based thing. And so most of this is going to be very similar for women. What I'm trying to put forward is this idea that while you are, throughout the entire assessment and treatment process, being able to have a women's consciousness lens and understand how deeply impacted women can be from these different pieces of history and of imprinting.
So I guess the way I take that, tell me if I'm wrong, is that this could potentially have a huge impact on that sexual health plan part. What does that column look like that we want? What if people failed to imagine potentially because of some of these messages, or
exactly
ways of behaving that they've been indoctrinated to, or something like that? Like they get to rethink that whole thing and think, what do I actually want?
Right. An example would be, a woman that comes in, she says, I'm a porn addict. And I say, okay, tell me about that. And she says, well, my partner came in and she saw me looking at porn and she told me that I'm a porn addict. Okay, do you enjoy it? Yes. How often are you looking at it? Maybe once a week. Okay. And so you're really wanting to check in with this client. Is this a problem for you, or is this a problem, an interpersonal problem that you might be having because you have different values around sexual imagery than your partner?
Right.
Maybe your partner comes from a cultural background that really condemns sexual imagery.
And then some of these oppressive messages might impact somebody's feelings about their porn viewing, or what porn they might even be watching, or something like that is worthwhile to talk about, right?
Right. I mean, women, I don't want to blanket women.
All of us women. Yeah, right.
I speak for the entire cisgender women. I think that we are just so taught to not even think sexually, unless, of course, we're put in the role of the sexualized woman.
Right. But even then, we're supposed to be someone else's idea of what sexual is, right? Not our own. Right.
And we're not supposed to be multifaceted. We're not supposed to be complicated.
Yeah.
So going back to power over sexual functioning, appearance, and pleasure, you have sexually explicit media, and this is very obvious how children are growing up and their sexual education is the internet, and it's not accurate most of the time. And so there are a lot of studies coming out around just the impact it's having on both genders, in their body, in their appearance, and how they're supposed to function sexually, and what noises they're supposed to make, and what smells they're supposed to have. And there's a lot of debate around, is porn, is it inherently an awful thing for people? And then you have, the feminist porn book, and you have, people arguing for ethical porn,
right?
Ethical imagery, where all bodies are represented in accurate ways, more accurate ways. People with a disability, or people, with all size bodies, all cultures. And I think that can actually be very healing for women to see that represented. I think reading erotica, if it is, like Nancy Friday, how eye-opening was that?
Yeah.
All of these stories of women that actually are sexual in all of the different ways that they feel sexually.
Yeah.
And then the last point that I found, the last thread that I found in looking up the history of women's sexuality was intersectionality. So this is the power over sexual and social value. And this, I think, is so rife for a deeper dig. This is every way that we identify in the world, every identity marker we have. So class, race, ability, age, gender, sexual orientation, body size, it all impacts a perceived social standing and value. And this was conceptualized, intersectionality was conceptualized by Kimberly Crenshaw. And I've adopted it here for women because of all of these different possible markers of how it can impact their self-concept, their sexual self-concept. And then that in turn can be impacting it can influence the attachment If you have a very low sexual self-concept, are you more willing to engage in problematic behaviors or risky behaviors because you are trying to connect?
So have you brought all three of these through lines into your assessment part? I mean, are you specifically trying to assess along all three of those lines and have that conversation, or are you waiting for this to emerge where it emerges?
So far, I just I just hold them. I hold them in my mind as I sit with the client and I listen and I listen for any flags that might be coming up, just something to get more information about. Again, I'm not going to assign anything to women when they come into my office.
Right.
I think that all of these through lines, each of them impact the three clinical areas that OCSB focuses on, which is self-regulation, attachment regulation, and sexual and erotic conflict. So all of these potential imprintings on these three clinical areas, which then we are working to create a more balanced decision-making in these areas. If you're really struggling to self-regulate, because of a historical marker, and you're struggling to be present in the moment enough to self-regulate, to not engage or cross a boundary, it's just bringing more awareness to everything to help slow it down.
Yeah. So the last question I have for you is, what message would you give women listening who maybe don't feel like they're out of control, right? OCSB is not the issue, but it seems like so much of what you're talking about is relevant to all of us in terms of really optimizing our sexual health or finding their best sexual expression that we can or something. So what would be, I'm setting you up here, but what's your parting message for anyone listening who maybe isn't struggling with OCSB, but could take some value from what you're talking about? I know it's a big question and you didn't know it was coming.
It's such a big question. Well, first, before I answer that, I want to say that my work has been for cisgender women, and I want to make that really clear. I'm not speaking for gender fluid. I didn't research trans folks, and I didn't really focus hardly enough on people of color.
Yeah. Okay.
So I want to invite everyone else.
Yes, right. Somebody take up the baton, right? Keep going.
And my parting message is, sex is complicated, but it's also fun.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's so interesting, and to not make assumptions, around what someone may like, why they may like it. Just sitting in the moment with the person you're with, if you're with a person, or sitting in the moment with yourself and just sitting with who is this person fundamentally, it's kind of heady.
Yeah, that's okay. I think it's fascinating. And I would imagine that people are maybe thinking about these through lines and the impact that they've had, or am I really living in an honest way? Am I focusing on pleasure? All those principles of sexual health also seem really relevant and important. So, well, thank you so much. I feel like we just scratched the surface. I get a sense that you could talk about this for a very, very long time.
I'm going to have to get a whiteboard next time.
There you go. Except it's only audio, so that we have to describe it. But I appreciate the scratching the surface of this topic, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.